All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Field Crops virtual breakfast. My name is Steve Whittington. I'm a field crops educator based out of Montcalm County, Michigan, and I will be your host for this morning's virtual breakfast. So, without further ado, let's move into our topic this morning, which is going to be dry bean planting considerations with our MSU specialist, Scott Bales. Scott,
Thanks.
I'll go ahead and stop sharing and you can take it away.
Perfect. Thanks for the introduction, Steve. As we mentioned, today we're going to talk about dry bean planting considerations. All right, I'll assume this is pulled up and looking as is. But yeah, just thanks for the introduction. Once again, my name is Scott Bales. So I'm a dry bean specialist, working out of the research farm here in Frankenmuth, Michigan for Michigan State University, the Saginaw Valley Center. Today we'll be talking about dry bean planting and some other considerations. Here's a brief outline of what we're going to go over today. Just some basic dry bean, agronomics, the basics of planting, things like rates, depths, overall soil conditions that we're looking for, and other considerations that we do have around that topic. We'll briefly highlight just some current research that we have going on, in regards to planting dates. And then I'll also, cover dry bean growth staging. This is something that came up. Jenna Fowler and I were talking about this year, and it's something that's not always widely used in dry beans, but I think there are some key stages that we should be aware of and know how to identify in the field. So we'll kind of start this out with a really poor joke, but does anybody know why the bean got a promotion? It's because he was outstanding in his field. And we know that was terrible, but got to give me credit. Dry bean jokes are quite difficult to come up with. So we'll get into the actual educational, portion of this as we talk about just some basic agronomics. And this year is predicted to be a big year for black beans in the state of Michigan. So we do have some growers who maybe haven't raised beans in a few years, back into dry beans, or maybe for the first time. So some of this we just like to kind of recap as some of our basics and recommendations for dry bean systems. Really, we're looking for 3 to 4 year type rotations for our best disease management, really. We talk about some of our root diseases and other fungal pathogens that we do deal with in dry beans as they are somewhat sensitive. An example of that, would be corn, dry beans, and wheat as a typical rotation near the thumb. Sometimes sugar beets included as well. But we really do, like this concept of extending the diversity in our rotation by, integrating cover crops into that system. Whether that's, rye before dry beans, and basically wheat after dry beans too, really makes a nice system where we can keep living roots in that soil for as long as possible. And with dry beans being such a short season crop, it gives us a nice window on either side of that. Variety selection, that's already done for this year. You guys have your seed on ordered and it's probably on farm, waiting to be planted. But I will put in a plug for, Extension Bulletin E3465. I spend a good chunk of my time working on those trials, throughout the year. That is our MSU performance trials for dry bean systems. So it is a great resource for variety selection when we are making those decisions. And then some basics for, our systems. Most dry beans in the state of Michigan are planted into conventional tillage. Not saying other systems can't work, but this is kind of our standard operating procedure. And really the foundation of that, is weed control and stand establishment. PPI herbicides are really the foundation that we're building our season-long weed control off of, which typically are group 3, most likely tank mix with the group 15 to get us our best protection from weeds that we can. And then I'll say, crop residue is really our friend, especially when inclement weather comes. Sometimes establishing dry beans can be the hardest part of the season for us. When we get rain and wind, they are a little bit of a finicky crop to get out of the ground. And to kind of recap that, I'll go forward here. I took this photo yesterday. We had some rain. We really pounded some soil flat. That was freshly worked, and then all of a sudden we had nice sunny conditions, dried things out, and 30-mile-an-hour winds. And all of a sudden, soil tries to take flight. And this is something that we do see, quite often in the Thumb and Saginaw Valley when we get into dry bean planting season. And this is what I mean by, crop residue or cover crop residue is really our friend, to help hold onto that soil, help protect beans once they are emerged, because we can get into replant situations when we do get, wind burn on those beans. And then to back up, one of the thresholds that I like to keep for overall soil conditions is looking at soil temps. I try to monitor that more closely than what our calendar actually says. More likely than not, typically we generally fall into that last week of May, first week of June, when we do start planting beans. But I like to kind of use the threshold of 65 degrees for a soil temp with a rising trend and good weather forecasted to really help with emergence. So if we look at where we are actually at, for soil temps at both 2 and 4 inches, here at the farm in Frankenmuth, we have surpassed that 65-degree mark, at least at this point. So that kind of, checks one of our considerations off our list of things to think. Are we ready to start planting beans? And to me, we have surpassed that threshold for soil temp. That once conditions allow, we are ready to start planting, the 2024 crop. Other considerations, on that list would be soil moisture. Dry beans are typically easier to establish when soils are drier than they are wet. We can have a tendency to run into some emergence issues when we do get soil crusting. Also, early season root diseases can be an issue that are typically, better mitigated, in dry conditions. However, we don't always have control of that. But the biggest and probably most challenging, condition is upcoming weather patterns. We really want to avoid, those heavy rainstorms that can impact and cause crusting that lead to emergence issues. Other considerations that we do have that Dennis Pennington is much more of an expert on is our following wheat crop, if that is our rotation. If we do decide to delay dry bean planting with the current length of maturities that we're working with, especially in black beans, it is something we have to think about of when we want to get that wheat crop planted and those seeding rates for that wheat crop. So to go over some basic, dry bean populations, about 2/3 of our crop is going to be seeded in what I would call narrow rows, 20 to 22 inch rows. And when we have, good soil temps, 65 degrees or above, our base recommendation is 100 to 130,000 seeds per acre, assuming a standard germination, on those seed lots. If we are in wide rows, 30 inches, you can pull that recommendation down about 10%. And if you are growing kidney beans, as this recommendation above is for our indeterminate varieties, so that's our black, navy, and small red type market classes. But if you're growing, light red kidneys, dark red kidneys, etc., we can pull that down about another 10%. So you're pulling 20% total off that base recommendation if we are in those, large seeded determinate growth types. And really, this recommendation was, based off, multiple years and locations of research done here at Michigan State University, where we found, most often emerged populations of 70,000 plants per acre, support average yield, which we consider, less than 35 bags to the acre in 20 to 22 inch rows. We did find that sometimes, higher emerged planting populations above 70,000 plants per acre can support above average yields. If we are really looking to push above that, 3,500 weight, which I would like to say is a great goal for all of us. But with our current, genetics and general weather conditions, I like to keep it, in that, sub 35 type prediction, unless we have some really special farms that we're working with. In North Dakota, worked on this topic at the same time, where they found that, dry beans do have a yield advantage, in 20-inch rows versus 30-inch rows, which we have found as well in Michigan, and thus the adoption of narrow rows in our systems. But they did find that, in years of low white mold pressure, is when that yield advantage really came out. If we threw, high white mold pressure in, more times than not, the yield advantage to that narrow rows and also to higher plant populations, like we're talking here, above 70,000 emerged plants, can be erased. One way to mitigate that, is increased management, so fungicide use in the system. So that's just an important caveat to the system, as we're talking about row widths and also planting populations. For base, planting depth, we really like to say just plant to consistent moisture. The worst thing we can have in the spring are inconsistent stands and delayed emergence if we are in dry soil from different pockets within that field. That creates inconsistency at harvest time and can create, what we'd call pick or immature beans that do get harvested, with the rest of our crop. Overall depth for a goal, 1.5 inches is ideal, but do not plant more than 3 inches deep. If we do get into those dry type conditions where we have to plant deeper to find more moisture. The way this year is going, and maybe Jeff has a good outlook for us on what soil moisture will be like. So far, we have had plenty. So hopefully, we're on the shallower side of planting for the season, unlike last year. And as I previously stated, dry conditions are generally better than wet, but it is important to be patient, and really consider those upcoming, weather patterns that are coming down the pipeline. I mentioned, dry beans are a short season crop. Really, we have the better part of a month that we can consider our standard planting window. Obviously, there's considerations, with harvest time and wheat planting at the end of that. But as far as the frost concern in Michigan in the fall for our maturities, we do have a pretty good window here that we can work with. So it can be important to be patient, as we're watching the weather and watching our soil conditions. It seemed like Monday morning my phone was ringing off the hook. Was it, too early to plant dry beans, or could we plant dry beans? Should we plant dry beans? And this is the current focus of a trial we're running here, in Frankenmuth, but also something that they worked on in North Dakota, over 3 years. And this is getting to be a little bit dated now. But essentially what they found is that when they planted early, they did not find a significant yield difference between their standard planting dates and late planting dates. You can see a slight numerical trend there, but the biggest difference they seen was the days from planting to emergence, which is really a critical time in dry beans. That's when we're worried about weather, we're worried about crusting. Really, we want that window to be as short as possible from planting those beans to emergence. And when we do plant earlier into those colder soils, it takes upwards as twice as long for those beans to emerge. So it does increase our risk there a little bit. So as I mentioned, that was a little bit dated. We're working with some new varieties that I really am excited about. I think have a lot of vigor, a little more resilience to them, than varieties that we have had in the past. So we did establish a trial for the first time here in Frankenmuth. We used, standard, row spacing across everything at 20 inches and standard planting populations at 130,000 seeds per acre. We pushed to the high end of that recommendation as we knew we were really going to be pushing the envelope, on some of these planting dates. Our goal was to have 5 planting dates here, May 6th, May 13th, May 20th, May 27th, and June 3rd. So far, sitting here today, we have got those first 3 in. Looking at the forecast, it looks like we might have a slight delay on this May 27th if the rain does come through as predicted. And overall, I was really looking to test not only a planting date, but also, varietal tolerance, to those planting dates. Looking at navies, blacks, and small reds. Within navies and blacks, we have a range of maturities from some really early maturing varieties to more of our full season and even longer varieties here to see if we can't get a benefit from, pushing those a little bit earlier, giving them a longer time in the fall to finish out, and also have a high quality harvest, hopefully in September rather than October. So I'll just kind of highlight, those first 2 planting dates, May 6th, we were warmer than normal, still below that 65 degrees threshold that we typically use, right around 62 degrees. You can see we had a bit of a downward slope here to our second planting date on the 13th, but really holding in those high 50s to low 60s. So I went out and took some photos of these yesterday to show you guys what they're looking like, as of right now. We have planting date number 1 on the left, planted on May 6th. Similar to what North Dakota found, days from planting to emergence or VC, we had about 14 days on that first planting. So definitely an extended period of time. Planting date number 2, May 13th. I wouldn't quite call those, fully emerged yet. You can see an up close photo of what they actually look like yesterday morning. They're getting close, but they're not going to be drastically shorter than that 14. I'm going to guess somewhere in that 12-day range until we get, full emergence of those unifoliates. The downside that we have had is we really had two heavy rainfall events on both May 17th and May 20th that I believe will negatively impact, some of those planting dates. So definitely more to come on this trial. We'll have a field day at the farm, and I'm really excited to help be able to show, what we've learned from this trial at that point. So then I'll kind of move into the last little bit I have here on dry bean stages. As I said, these are something that generally are not widely used in dry beans, especially once we get into the reproductive stages. But I do believe there's some important stages in there for us to be able to identify. So we'll move quickly, and all these are in North Dakota's production guide. If you do look between the U.S. recommendations, and Canadian recommendations, there are some discrepancies between stages and how they're actually identified. Typically, I use the recommendations from North Dakota State University A111-20, which is their dry bean production guide. So our first stage we have, would be VE. That's that hypocotyl emergence, really what guys would call the beans being in the crook. And the importance of this stage to me, is this is the one stage we really want to avoid for field rolling. We know fields can be rolled right after planting. We know that can be, rolled, after VC, which is a cotyledon and unifoliate emergence. But, when that VE stage is when we want to avoid that. The hypocotyl can be really fragile and can snap, if we do attempt to roll during those stages. I won't spend too much time on the rest of the V stages after that. Most of us, we're familiar with those. Our herbicide labels are really written off V stages, and really it's counting our trifoliates. Our first developed trifoliates, often occurs at the third node, and generally you're going to expect to put on, one node per week, through V3, that third fully emerged trifoliate. And then at that point, we're really going to go into rapid growth. And at that point, I think that's when most guys lose track, where we're at in V stages, because we're putting on a node, every 3 to 4 days, depending on weather. So it's really rapid growth as we progress towards row closure. And then, the next real important step for us, is going to be our reproductive stage, R1. And there's some discrepancy here too in what guys would call R1. Some guys will use terms like, full blossom versus, R1 versus half blossom. And really that's where I think some of the confusion can come in. But R1, is defined as one blossom open at any node. Typically, it's towards the bottom of the plant, those early nodes. And also your vine and tendril will begin to show, if it is a variety that does have a vine. And typically this is, 45 to 50 days after planting, once you get to that stage. And that's important because that's really your cutoff for most herbicide applications and also the beginning of your fungicide timings. That's when that window opens up. So then as we move into the rest of these R stages, this is where it does become, a little more complicated. As we just covered R1, then we move to R2. And a lot of guys will call this pin pod. So that's where you see, half-inch pods, at the first blossom position. Those really small pods at the bottom, and you'll see that the blossoms have really sloughed off. And this is generally regarded as our optimal time for fungicide applications when we're talking about white mold. But what I will point out here is these stages are very close. So sometimes I think we get a little hung up, on what exactly the stage is, when most years we're only talking of a difference of 3 days between R1 and R2. Then we'll move on through R3 and R4, and really these are based, on that pod size at the bottom of the plant. As you progress to 1-inch pods at R3 and 2-inch pods at R4. And then as we move into, R5, that's going to be 3-inch pods. You're going to be able to start to actually feel the seeds there. Typically, this is where our second fungicide applications are coming in, if we are in a 2-pass type program. R6 is really the maximum length on pods, and R7 is where our oldest pods are fully developed. They're going to be full length. You're going to have pods all the way up to the top of the plant. Your tendril will remain in blossom, so this can be confusing when we're talking about fungicides, because you'll see those flowers and want to protect them. But really at R7 is where we're going to generally have a cutoff for fungicide efficacy when we're talking about our fungal pathogens. So that's kind of the importance, as we get to that stage. And then as we move towards R8 and R9, this is where we're really starting to see maturity. And R9 is going to be our important one here, is 80% of the pods are yellow and ripening with no more than 30% green leaves. And really, this is our desiccation time. To be on label and have optimal quality, the really important stage and somewhat difficult stage to identify in the field. So really the importance of that. And with that, though, I will wrap this up. And once again, all these stages are available in the North Dakota Production Guide. But I want to leave plenty of time here for Jeff and to get us to the weather so we know if we can start planting our dry edible beans.
And with that, I think we'll get into some question and answer if we have any, which it looks like we do have a few. David asks, Scott, did any of the research that you've done so far use or test hydrogen peroxide products to assist with white mold control?
Yeah. So that's a great question, Dave, and thanks for relaying that, Stephen. So I had worked with a product called Oxidate. Oh, it was probably back in 2019 or so. We had run it in our mold screening. Overall, we didn't have great results with it at the time. However, since then, I know some different, industry groups have taken a different approach to its use. As more of a real rescue treatment, and with some higher rates and really high levels of carrier volumes, talking 80 to 100 gallons to the acre of water, to really soak the crop, in an emergency situation. They've seen some marginal benefits to it. So a mixed bag. We have worked with it, but that's probably an evolving topic too. And I'm not sure if Marty's on still or not, if they've worked with it, in soybeans at all or not either. But welcome to have his opinion.
Scott, I could just comment quickly. Yeah, we've looked at it, Oxidate, for several years in soybeans. Never at really high application volumes, so that would be really interesting to look at. But as a curative, like once the damage is already done, it doesn't matter. You're not going to rescue that infected stem. Maybe it will clean things up on the outside, but yeah, but I'd be certainly interested and open to hearing, situations where it has appeared to work. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Marty, for that comment, and Scott for addressing that question. If you have any other questions that you'd like to ask, feel free to unmute yourself. You can also drop those in the Q&A or the chat below. I do have a question for Scott. What are some of the challenges that this sort of weather presents where you've got intense rainfall that we might have experienced in the past week or so? You did mention that it forms crusting. What are some specific challenges to look for and maybe some solutions for dry bean producers when we have those intense rainfalls that produce that crust on the fields?
Yeah, so that's, one year in, year out, one of our biggest challenges. And to me, the one thing I've seen that's helped, that it's kind of not something we can necessarily implement for this year, but, is that cover crop into the rotation. Keeping a good stand of rye ahead of dry beans, terminating it, incorporating it, keeping, just that crop residue in that upper couple inches of the soil really has helped, prevent crusting when we do get those situations for dry beans to emerge through. The other thing that we can change this year is just risk mitigation. Say if you have, 200 acres of beans, let's try to not plant them all in one day. I know it's really hard to do because once we get the planters rolling, we want to finish it up. But if that's split into 450-acre fields, maybe put in 2 this week, 2 next week. And then if we do have, a negative weather event, whether that be now or in August, we're at least a little staggered in our development, our emergence, to help mitigate things. Because there's things like rotary hose to break crust and all of those good things that we've used for a great number of years, but it's no solution just for improving our soil health, our soil tilt, and B, just trying to mitigate the timing of things.
Yeah, great advice. I was gonna ask a specific question about rotary hose, but yeah, you beat me to it. That's a great implement to break up that crust. David, I think has a follow-up question, Scott, on the research around hydrogen peroxide, but does oxidate help with stopping the spread of new white mold or new molds in beans?
Yeah, I'm not sure if Marty's still here or not. I'd let him take a pass at that. If so, I see he's popping back up.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the problem with oxidate is that it'll just like we use it, in a wound on us, it would sanidate right then and there, but it doesn't have any long-lasting activity. So I think, oxidate, hydrogen peroxide has been used in other systems, other cropping systems where we're making very frequent applications and that there can be some activity. But for managing white mold in soybean and dry bean, I think it's very challenging. Again, happy to hear if people are having good success with it. But just in our hands, even putting 3 applications on soybeans, we didn't see any difference to the non-treated check. And spiking it in with a fungicide as well, or putting it on at the same time, it didn't increase the efficacy of that fungicide. So we've played with it quite a few times. We haven't done the high carrier volume, and that's definitely something I would try and do to, see if there's anything else to it. But yeah, that's kind of what I have at the moment. If there's activity, be very short-lived, I guess.
Yeah, good information, Marty. I appreciate that. I hope that helps answer your question, David. Hannah Booms is alluding to a good opportunity to kind of move into opening up the floor to other specialists that might have some reports or some updates to give for our virtual breakfast session. Chris, I think this was directed towards you. I don't know if you can read that or not, but insect larva pressure in cornfields. Can grubs and other insects larvae affect the vegetables growing in that field?
Yeah, if it's something generic like grubs, grubs would pretty much eat any roots that are there for the most part. But if it's something like corn rootworm, which hasn't hatched yet, I mean, those are specific to corn. So, or if it was something like seed corn maggot, that's pretty generic. It didn't come from the corn, but it might have been there. I've seen seed corn maggot on vegetable transplants in the past, like cabbage and such, even in a raised bed, planted after field crops like rotting potato. That's like the worst. So it depends on the insect, but some of the generic-y kind of soil insects will eat stuff put in front of them, no matter what it is.
Wonderful. Thanks, Chris. And then while you have the floor, if there's any other updates that you'd like to give to the virtual breakfast crowd this morning, maybe for the upcoming week, you are free to do so.
So alfalfa weevil, at least from like central Michigan down, that's pupating now, starting to pupate, and potato leafhopper is here. So for alfalfa, again, coming up on wind currents and Jeff's wind currents. I've only seen adults so far, so they will start to lay eggs. So those early dry bean plantings, those are mostly seed treated now, so that'll take care of it for a portion of time. And then if you're managing new growth on alfalfa, just something to think about.
Wonderful. And in the chat,
I have a follow-up to that, Steve. Chris, for the potato leafhoppers, what is the life cycle on those adults laying eggs, and then the nymphs and the big hatch for those insects?
You just said it. You're perfect. So you have adults, and then they will lay eggs right into the plant material. They'll slice them in. Those eggs will hatch, and they'll start to be overlapping generations, because we probably get some adults coming early and some arrive a little bit later. And the nymphs and the adults both feed. So they're doing the same kind of damage. Actually, there's a little bit of a different kind of damage that both do. But as they feed, then the plant begins to grow inside kind of wrong. We used to think there was like an actual toxin injected, but the saliva that goes in there kind of makes the plant grow poorly in a way that around that feeding site, it kind of blocks the ability of the plant to move water and nutrients around. And then you get that accumulation in the leaf tip, and then you get the leaf yellowing. So when you start to see yellowing, there's already damage that's been done there. But then if it turns brown, of course, that's the very worst.
How
So-
fast is the timing between the adult and then the juveniles hatching? How long does that take?
It's dependent on temperature. So off the top of my head, I can't remember the actual like degree days until hatching, how many degree days it would take in a lab. But I mean, you'll start to get, say, if they arrived the 20th or the 18th, by the end of next week, you might start to see some little nymphs already. And they have hundreds of host plants. So if they can't find it in your field, they'll just go colonize something on the field edge until a crop comes up.
And the reason I'm asking is because of for second cutting, a lot of people have already taken first cutting, and second
Right.
cutting will start. And I just wondered about some people get pretty aggressive with spraying for leaf hoppers, even in second cutting.
Well, yeah, that would be and I would look at new growth too, because you could have a big plop of winged winged adults that were deposited across an area or a field. Sometimes they get picked up and moved and they fall out of the rain events as well. So, and again, the threshold is depending, and I have to remember on alfalfa, but new growth, of course, is, get 3-inch growth. There's not much there. So you gotta look at that very closely. For dry beans, for Scott's dry beans, people are typically putting a seed treatment on that. And that replaces that first spray that we used to do many years ago, or things like Thymet or something that used to be put on very, very early.
And Chris, just one real quick follow-up on your question or your comment about timing and the adults. And spot on. We have had a couple of transport events. The one was very recent, earlier this week, and so we likely had movement of more adults into especially certainly southern and central lower Michigan with those southerly winds ahead of the last weather system. That was a really sort of a classic meteorological type of transport event. So timing wise, I would expect that there probably are more there than there were there a week ago.
And we're a little bit early on some of these things. So, I mean, I don't often see this, but I've already seen 2 adult monarchs. And to me, that seemed really early. I mean, my brain it's been so warm. I kept thinking it was end of June or something, and it's not. It was mid-May when I saw them. So there's probably more than just potato leafhopper. Things get moved up and then they just kind of get carried along. Their wings are flapping, but they're making really good time because they're getting blown along by these wind currents. Alfalfa aphids are here. They were carried along. Some of the small grain aphids are here. Cereal leaf beetle is around at a little bit higher levels than what we typically see. So I guess, if people are able to get planting done, then go out and just walk those fields and look to see what's going on. A lot of seed corn maggot in beans. And again, you're planting early into situations, you're essentially feeding seed corn maggot. It's not the maggot's fault. It's your fault for giving them the food. So that's the way it goes. And so I think I've gotten a lot of pictures showing maggot damage as well. But if those beans can pop out of the ground, they'll typically grow right out of it. They just need some sun and a little bit of moisture.
Thank you, Chris. Great updates, great information. I do want to mention a resource that was put in the chat box from one of our weed specialists, Erin Hill. She's got a great article resource out there that walks you through the steps on how to take a better picture or photograph for identifying plants that you might be starting to see in your field. We are coming on crop maintenance where we're starting to see maybe a weed push in our field. So if you are trying to identify plants in your fields and want to send those into your local extension, that article is a great resource. It shows you how to get better results from your pictures that you might have. Thanks for sharing that, Erin.
And it probably works for insects too. I didn't see it, but whatever she says for little plants, probably that could help us with an insect ID as well.
Exactly. And one of the one of the ways that we achieve a lot of success in identifying plants or insects is from folks sending in really good quality photographs and doing just a few changes to make that photograph better. Troy Jenkins did have a comment. Looks like he's a guest from Northern Indiana. Beginning to see bean leaf beetle, but below threshold, so we can expect those numbers to go up as well too, especially with the weather patterns we've been having, I think. Dennis, you have the floor, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. Just a quick update on wheat. We are running ahead of normal in terms of development stages. We started flowering notes in our research trials 11 days earlier this year compared to last year. And so in the southern part of the state, flowering fungicides are already going on, even in the southwest part of the state. And the crop is moving along very rapidly. And in fact, it's catching some guys off guard as far as being ready to spray, and they weren't really ready for it. We're also seeing quite a lot of stripe rust out in the field. Marty put together a good article that just went out in the Michigan Wheat newsletter with information about it and more resources. They're pretty much all of the fungicides that we have available to us are rated either very good or excellent on stripe rust. So there's a little bit of a question as far as timing. How bad is a stripe rust infestation? How close are you to flowering timing as far as deciding do you make one application if you have it or make one? So that's a discussion that we can have with individual growers based on their scenario. But yeah, the wheat crop is moving along very rapidly. Chris, we are seeing quite a bit of cereal leaf beetles out there, some adult beetles, and some young nymphs, as well as some older ones feeding on the leaves. So I think the threshold on cereal leaf beetles is one larva per flag leaf, if that sounds right, Chris. But update on what's going on in the wheat crop.
All right, thanks for that update, Dennis.
Yeah, so to follow up with Dennis, at heading, the cereal leaf beetle threshold is one or more larvae per stem. They should be pretty apparent because they're kind of at the top of the plant. You can kind of see them kind of scraping away there. And if you have small larvae, you may want to wait a little bit because they were all controlled by biological control. And I think some of the reasons that we're getting this increase in cereal leaf beetle, not just mild winter, but sometimes we're putting fungicide on and we're just throwing insecticide in. So like up until a few years ago, I only ever saw cereal leaf beetle on spring planted grains like oats. You hardly ever saw them on wheat, but they're very apparent in the last couple of years. So something is changing.
Yeah, and I've seen fields where I think we're very near that threshold, and others where there's enough adults and small ones that I would definitely want to be scouting those fields on a regular basis to keep track of that. So yeah, I don't know why, and I've seen it across a lot of fields, across a large geographic region. It's not just in a localized area.
Yeah, it's very depressing in a way because, this pest came into Michigan first in Berrien County. We are the place that was found first in the entire United States. And this university for years led the cereal leaf beetle biological control program that was highly successful in releasing essentially free biological control. And if that's starting to break down, that's sad.
Yeah.
And costly.
Well, Dennis, thank you for that update. And Chris, we really appreciate that. We're going to take one more question here. It's going to be from Brad, and then we'll wrap up today's virtual breakfast. Brad's question is, any rescue measures for corn rootworm infestation in early planted corn? Looks like we have a corn following corn situation in that particular field. So Chris, looks like that's a question for you maybe.
Many years ago, there used to be some rescue things you could try to do. You could get things that you cannot no longer use, like a Firadan sort of product, and you'd apply it on, kind of like broadcast it, and then you'd do a rain dance and you'd hope it was rained in, essentially like treating a lawn for grubs. And that never worked. or Lorsban 15G or something. Those things didn't work. There is essentially no rescue for corn rootworm infestation. But if this is second year corn, is that what it was?
Yes.
In early planted corn. Well, I mean, if this is second year corn, you might not have any corn rootworms at all. Sometimes you can have 5-year corn on campus. Sometimes we don't see a lot. So what I don't know is rootworms haven't hatched yet. It's coming up soon, probably another couple weeks. So I guess we don't know yet what's going to happen in that field.
Looks like it's a little too early to say right now.
Too early to tell, but there is no rescue treatment now.
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody for those questions. We appreciate your participation in the virtual breakfast this morning. Again, next week you can join us again, Thursday, 7 a.m. We're going to be here with Marty Chilvers talking about wheat fungicide applications. Special thanks to Scott Bales this morning for bringing us into dry beans and what's going on in the field. And yeah, we'll see you here at virtual breakfast next week. Thanks, everybody.